context of the role of the GAR, as we think through this global assessment and the reason for a special report, it has everything to do with the fact that we see the attendant increases in water scarcity issues, in agriculture and food security, and basically the globally connected nature of our economic systems. Now, when we think about climate change and we ask, well, how will climate change be manifested in the context of impacts? It's mainly through water. And one of the ways in which we deal with water and water scarcity is in how we manage drought. From that standpoint, the UNDRR and other disaster risk reduction efforts have focused heavily on things like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, very discrete single events. Drought, on the other hand, can span weeks to decades and can cover small watersheds to thousands of square kilometers. So it is, in a sense, a new challenge, but it is also one that helps us understand slow and fast onset risks. If we do not actually get at managing drought effectively, it will make managing adaptation and creating a more resilient future that much more difficult. So the importance of the GAR in this context is to highlight the complex nature of drought, but also to show the opportunities that effectively managing drought across global mechanisms in countries and communities offers for meeting long-term adaptation and sustainability. So as we think through this, I actually do not think we have an understanding of the complex nature of drought and that is part of the challenge. Cognitively, socially, and institutionally, we're not really good at dealing with rapid transitions. Our institutions don't adapt on those timeframes, and sometimes psychologically we don't as well. So we tend to be reactive. We tend to have the events and then look to how we could solve what has happened, as opposed to what the UNDRR calls prospective risk management. There's a difference there. Normal risk management has, if this will happen, what do we do? In an uncertain and changing environment, it is more what might be the surprises, what might be the changes that we cannot fully anticipate that require us to have the collaboration, the financing, the research, the applications, and the community engagement that reduces the likelihood of new risks being realized and emergent risks being managed. So in that context, as we think through the issue of drought is now much more. We've realized, of course, that it's much more than just, did an event happen and you have reduced precipitation and that affected crop loss? It's extremely important. But drought actually affects transportation systems and what we do for navigation. It affects soil quality and soil health, ecosystems. It affects energy generation. It affects global exports and imports of food and the virtual water that supports in it. Much, much more so than simply agricultural crop losses. Very, very important issue. But then the multiple dimensions that I just described is what the report gets at. Now, characterizing large systems like that, and we've tried to do it through land use planning, through integrated watershed management, through integrated coastal zone management. The characterization of large systems is important, but we do not manage large systems. We manage the human interactions with those systems. What this report does is identify the governance networks, the cases from the lived experience, how societies from India to the Mediterranean to the US have managed those risks over time, what has been learned, and then how that may be best applied to managing through a changing environment. In that context, the governance structures of the report are very clear on what we need to do globally to locally and how we coordinate and form coherence around large efforts such as the UNDRR Sendai framework, through the Paris Agreement, through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Aichi biodiversity targets, but also how nationally and locally we craft collaborative visions for a sustainable future. And the report points precisely in that direction. If we were to think through managing in a risk framework, what might happen and how we respond proactively, and couple that with how we might act prospectively before new risks arise, we actually get the entire framing for this report, how we manage justly and equitably from risk to resilience. In that setting, nature-based solutions are extremely important. The things that provide buffers in our systems, protected watersheds, protected natural environments, land restoration, reforestation becomes extremely important. Another issue is broadening the actor network. And what we mean by that is stronger inclusion of gender-based approaches, Indigenous peoples, people who have lived in regions and locales for millennia, who understand something about what it means to live through a changing environment. And then a third area is linking the research that we have more closely to action on the ground. As one of my mentors, a legendary person who shaped a lot of our field, Gilbert White, was fond of saying, if we know so much, why aren't we doing better? And that link between research, management, and people's capabilities to help develop research that meets the needs of their own lives is critical. The last area is aligning the financing for upfront action that helps reduce risk. We've known now for quite a long time that upfront, a bit of upfront investment actually reduces long-term risks. That's been known for a long time. Yet our actions are not commensurate with knowing that. And the reason for that has everything to do with the need to engage a broader community in those decisions, for them to understand the nature of the risks that they're facing, for the public-private interactions and sectors to play a role, but to also understand the consequences of the decisions that they make. A key part of systemic risk is that they're globally networked. Drought in one area of the world can affect food security in another, that they create local imbalances in the sense of pushing people onto marginal lands or the reduction of groundwater and soil. And a third aspect is what we call contagion, the decisions that we make in response to those risks. And sometimes when we do those things, we create risks for others. And what we need to be clear about is the risk that we're facing and the role of the public and private sector in acknowledging and addressing those risks, working with civil society to ensure that addressing the risks are also equitable and just. So to characterize 4 areas: nature-based solutions, a stronger link between research and management, broadening the actor network to include people who are affected and who might have actual solutions to bring to bear, the alignment of financing and coherence among the global mechanisms and along nations and states. So this report is making those recommendations from very disparate and yet connected groups. Many reports of these kinds are strictly academic and they draw on a published literature. This report actually brings in the people who are implementing those very programs and brings in, to the extent that we can, the communities who are affected. This approach is actually one that is innovative in the context of not simply acknowledging what we ought to do, but being very specific about how we do it. And I think this effort, one, to link the fact that risks related to climate and to drought in particular are changing at a rate that is unprecedented in terms of the present institutions that we have. It identifies that very clearly, but it also identifies pathways for actions that are grounded in people's experience and is grounded in the research and what we have been able to do to draw on the lessons from the past, in addition to shaping the future. In the context of an assessment is, what do we know? How well do we know it? What are the uncertainties and what do we need to do? The latter, on what we need to do, is offers a very, very strong role for the UNDR and its partners to work with finance institutions, with development institutions, to get the notion of systemic risks into their thinking. And the most critical aspect of this is to be able to put that idea into development plans and then help create a cadre of what we call norm entrepreneurs, individuals who are trained to make the system work as was intended. This is very different from training a meteorologist who might work on drought, or a climatologist, and it's very different from another social scientist looking at how risk is socially constructed, but in fact has to be transdisciplinary. The major effort that can come out of this report is, one, working with the other agencies to show that the Sustainable Development Goals, if they were to treat issues surrounding water and drought in its systemic and cascading fashion, would help us get to many of those goals. And two, help us understand the governance that is needed and the training of the professionals, local and otherwise, who are needed to make those transitions happen. A big part of the report is not simply what we ought to do, but how we craft and manage those transitions towards a more resilient set of partnerships globally. It is called for in the report, the global mechanism and the national resilience partnerships. I've helped develop precisely that within the US and within the Caribbean. The role, however, for the UNDR in the context of, and other partners, UNCCD is very central in this approach. There are many other UN agencies, certainly, that are dealing with climate services, such as the World Meteorological Organization, that works on how we get information into the hands of those who need it to make better decisions. The idea here then is to ensure that the very people who were involved in this, and if we look at the list of people who are engaged, many of them are also engaged in implementation. This is truly transdisciplinary in a sense, that we are tying knowledge about a process, studying something, with knowledge in a process with people whose roles are on implementation. That's unique in the setting. Those are the very people who can take the ideas in here back to their countries and show that our present approaches are being overwhelmed if we do not address systemic risk, if we do not align financing, and most critically, we do not build the equity that's needed so that those who are most effective can shape the trajectories of their lives. From that standpoint, the UNDR plays a strong role in making the results of the report visible, understandable, accessible, but has to do so with its partners who are all engaged in the Sustainable Development Goals. I chair the report writing for Sustainable Development Goal 6 for the US. And in the context of these impacts, there are already actions and information in here on how we deal with transboundary water risks that I can use in the context of planning. So there are things in here that are operationally very, very viable in terms of more efficient practices, sustainable cropping, rangeland management, and most critically, it describes what policy incentives and leverages might be used with our partners, with our development agencies. So what we really need to do is not simply have outreach, but have a specific effort on embedding the results of the report in practice. I helped develop for the United States something called the National Drought Information System, and we made a very, very clear distinction between the risk assessment, communication of that risk, and how knowledge gets embedded in practice. This latter issue is where we get back to the issue of climate services, information services for planning, but also empowering local communities to act on the knowledge being provided and the knowledge that they bring to the table. So from that standpoint, we need to move to include, but move beyond communication to working with how we embed knowledge in practice. And we offer in the report, in chapter 3, the types of alignment vertically from global to local and back up, and horizontally on collaborative vision building, on watershed management, on engaging diverse communities, on how that might be best done. Unlike broader reports, which attempt to just assess notions and are used for negotiations or otherwise, this particular report recognized that iterative learning is necessary, that we're learning to manage, that there's no plan today that'll fix every problem into the future. That requires the engagement of people of the public, private, and civil society sectors, but that it's contextual. We would be remiss in saying, here's a report that tells you how to do everything in your local setting. But what we do instead is provide how to assess a risk and how to create the conditions, the governance, the enabling conditions, the overcoming different kinds of perception of risk, the partnerships, the social protection that is needed to be applied in each context. So in no way are we assuming that we have produced one size fits all. Neither are we assuming that we're producing the details of every context. That's where people, using their own partnerships, their own perception, their own issues with which they have to deal, help shape the results of the report for the context in which they're acting. It would be misleading to say, well, we're reaching the local farmer. Well, that's easy to say, but in a sense, it's the wrong question. What we need to be sure of is that we've provided the enabling conditions that allows him or her to be able to work with their government, their partners, NGOs, and others to most effectively assess risk and act on the things that are affecting them. That is quite contextual. We take a very multi-method approach, very multidimensional from a disciplinary standpoint. We talk a whole lot about building networks. We address specific problems related to drought, but the most important issue is to recognize yet again that implementation is contextual, depending on people's capabilities, entitlements, and the risks that they're facing. So we offer a framework for how to do that, but the local application of it has to be done in partnership with the countries, the global mechanisms, and the financing partners that apply to a particular region. It would be naive to do otherwise. So we've talked quite a bit about the different practices, the different notions of what constitutes security, not just security of access to resources and the ability to use, but the personal security, the personal dignity of being able to helping people make choices about their own lives. From my standpoint, and the capacity that's needed, one of the most important things that should come out of this report is an understanding in the global community that addressing drought and more broadly disaster risk reduction in a prospective manner, as in a manner that acknowledges the systemic aspects of risk, actually gets us a long way towards adapting to climate change. In other words, adaptation without effective disaster risk reduction is not adaptation. Adaptation without iterative learning and community engagement is not adaptation. And without equitability, well, those are all dimensions that have been in the disasters risk literature for a long time and is now brought out very explicitly by a combination of disaster risk approaches and climate change in the context of drought. And so this issue offers us a lens through which, or a red thread rather, that helps us link disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we make that link very explicitly in the document. So if I was to stand back and say, yes, we want a more resilient communities and environment where we address growth, equity, and participation, and the environment. But I stand back and ask, for the global community, what does this mean? For me, it really is getting effective disaster risk reduction in the context of drought gets us a long way towards understanding how we adapt to a changing climate. In a sense, this report helps us culminate a lot of ideas that have been in previous GAR assessments. GAR 2011 had the first chapter on drought that we ever did in one of the GARs. The GAR 2019 outlines systemic risk. The IPCC report on extremes, the SRS report from 2012, and then more recently, the reports that we're seeing for 1.5 and land use, and so on, are all pointing us in this direction. This report synthesizes many of those lessons, but then takes them a bit further into saying, getting a DRR in governance, in incentives, in partnerships, in research and management gets us towards adaptation. It doesn't solve all of those problems, but it helps us learn how to do it.